Celeste is an action platformer about climbing a mountain. It's also a story about mental illness and overcoming obstacles. Above all, Celeste is a great game. There are lots of different things that can make a game great. Creative gameplay, charming visuals, or a catchy soundtrack can all make a game memorable and enjoyable on their own. Celeste is a game that has all of these things, but they're not what makes Celeste truly great. Celeste is great because it keeps you on the edge of your seat. It never fails to keep you engaged. Celeste is a game that positively commands your attention and makes you more than happy to hand it over. This is a tricky thing to accomplish, and every game attempts to achieve this goal in different ways. Some games rely on spectacle, with maps the size of real-world cities and visual effects straight from Hollywood. Others resort to basic psychological tricks, fostering something near addiction in the short term while feeling empty on a larger scale. Celeste is a game that manages to pull off satisfying rewards and the drive to play just one more level without a grandiose budget or any cheap tricks. It keeps your attention in a way that feels meaningful and leaves you feeling better for having played. There is no singular secret to Celeste's success in this respect. A surface-level examination will quickly reveal that Celeste's mastery of player engagement results from every one of the game's systems working in tandem. But since we don't have all day, I think 3 factors in particular can explain how Celeste manages to keep you captivated at every turn: narrative, challenge, and a bunch of little touches that might best be described as game feel. As a quick warning for anyone who hasn't played, I will be spoiling the story of Celeste in this video, and since I'd argue this game is worth anyone's time, I recommend you play it before watching this video, unless you're one of my students, in which case you waived your right to keeping games spoiler-free the moment you registered for this program, so keep watching. I should note before I begin that I'm far from an expert at playing Celeste. I'm no speedrunner. I'm complete trash, actually, a fact which is made painfully obvious by looking at my gameplay footage. My death count would require a mortuary the size of a small city just to keep up, and that's before even attempting the more challenging B-side versions of each level. As of this recording, I've completed the main storyline through Chapter 8, collected most of the A-side crystal hearts, and gathered about 120 strawberries. So, with this little embarrassing disclaimer out of the way, let's get to talking about how narrative helps sustain player engagement in Celeste. It might seem odd that I'm starting this discussion with story. Of all the things that come to mind when thinking about a fast-paced platformer, character development isn't exactly at the top of the list. That said, I think Celeste's narrative is an important part of what makes it so enjoyable, particularly on a first playthrough. Story clearly received a great deal of time and attention in this game. This isn't just shown through the cute dialogue and lovingly hand-drawn portraits in cutscenes either. The story in Celeste bleeds through to some extent in its carefully crafted gameplay arcs, environmental and level design, and even its soundtrack. This helps to lend the narrative a deeper sense of meaning and prevents it from feeling tacked on. Celeste's main story is divided into 7 chapters, each accompanied by a set of visually and mechanically distinct levels. Most chapters end with a boss segment that brings unique challenges and pushes the story forward. You play as Madeline, a young woman on a quest to climb Celeste Mountain, the game's namesake. It's clear from the start that the climb won't be easy, but Madeline is determined to prove that she can overcome whatever challenges the mountain throws her. Along the way, we meet a small but delightfully realized cast of characters. First, you encounter the Old Woman, a frank and occasionally sarcastic mentor of sorts, whom Madeline begrudgingly grows to accept as time wears on. Then you meet Theo, a fellow climber and Instagram-happy hipster always ready to bring a smile and a bit of encouragement. There's also Mr. Oshiro, the ghostly proprietor of a resort built into the mountainside. And, of course, there's the so-called part of you, Madeline's dark side doppelganger, affectionately referred to as Badeline by the developer. Though Madeline is the central focus of the story, each of these characters develop and change as you progress toward the summit. I wouldn't go so far as to call these individual arcs groundbreaking literature, but they did genuinely surprise me at times, veering away from the obvious path and keeping a refreshing sense of sincerity. Take the Old Woman as an example. She teases Madeline early on, and in response, our hero wastes little time in vocalizing her disdain, and vowing to prove the woman wrong. The obvious route here would be to have the old woman come around later in the story and become an enthusiastic cookie-baking cheerleader. Instead, Madeline grows to accept the old woman for who she is, respecting that she has a different perspective. Likewise, as the old woman gets to know Madeline, her advice becomes more heartfelt, without losing the blunt wisdom and rough edges that define her character. Both women grow and change throughout the story. But the best example of this sort of character development is the relationship between Madeline and her alter ego, Badeline. This relationship is actually the central focus of the plot, with all that mountain climbing mostly serving as context for the drama between the two. Madeline meets Badeline in Chapter 2, and I'm starting to realize as I write this that saying Madeline and Badeline over and over is just a recipe for disaster. Calling Badeline part of you feels a bit wordy though, so I'm just gonna call her Baddie from now on. Anyway, you first meet Baddie in Chapter 2, not far from the base of the mountain. She embodies Madeline's dark side, cruel, paranoid, and filled with doubt. Her first course of action is to try and convince Madeline to stop climbing. Naturally, Madeline refuses, and Baddie spends the rest of the chapter in hot pursuit, killing the player every time she catches up, and serving as the game's first boss escape sequence. This rivalry escalates over the next few chapters, establishing Baddie as a villain of sorts. The player's view is aligned with Madeline's perspective, and Madeline wants to be rid of Baddie's influence. The tension builds to its climax when Baddie sends them both careening down the mountain after a heated argument, losing all of Madeline's progress so far. Now, by this point in the story, I expected a final boss fight with Baddie to be right around the corner. This is a video game, after all, and if we're being honest, video game writing tends to adhere to some pretty stubborn tropes. I'd be in for a suitably video gamey showdown of good versus evil. Light would triumph over darkness, and Baddie would be destroyed. Then Madeline would make her way to the summit unburdened, shedding her negativity and starting her life afresh. But Celeste doesn't do this. Instead, after falling down the mountain, you track down a frightened Baddie and convince her that you'll both be stronger if you work together. You don't annihilate Baddie in a blinding flash of positivity. Instead, Madeline tells Baddie that she accepts her for who she is. Taken aback by Madeline's sympathy, Baddie agrees to do the same, and the two come together to finish climbing the mountain, eventually reaching the summit together. This isn't the ending I expected for a video game, though it would be a pretty predictable arc in something like a Pixar movie. But I like this twist because of how the characters of Madeline and Baddie develop as a result. Both change in learning to accept each other, but neither gives up who they are. Madeline acknowledges that fear and pain are parts of being human, things to be understood and managed rather than thrown away. But she still stays positive and determined on the whole. Baddie agrees to talk things through and put more faith in Madeline's abilities, so long as she is heard rather than shunned as something to be gotten rid of. But Baddie still retains her fear and uncertainty and still throws out the occasional sarcastic barb. The reason this is great, besides the fact that it allows Baddie to stay adorably dark, is because it subverts the expectation that everyone will just bend to Madeline's will as the protagonist. Characters grow into each other, forming more natural relationship dynamics and preserving their identity. It's refreshing to see this type of writing in games at all, and Celeste is full of little moments like this. It's these moments that kept me fully invested in the story of Celeste from start to finish. I wanted to play out every conversation between Madeline and Theo and smile at the selfies they'd take together. I eagerly awaited the next appearance of the old woman, sure to deliver a suitably sharp remark tinged with helpful wisdom. I relished these moments so much that Celeste's story somehow killed the completionist in me the first time through. I loved these characters for their sincerity, and I wanted to see what happened to them. And so, on my first time through, I rushed the climb, taking the direct path through each chapter and largely ignoring optional challenges. Of course, the game promptly smacked me in the face for this at the end of my first playthrough, berating Madeline's pie-making abilities as I'd failed to collect but a few of the quote-unquote optional strawberries. On my second playthrough, I paid much more attention to optional challenges and collectibles, at least partially to erase the game's indictment of my baking skills. Even though I was more focused on upping my dash skills and looking for secrets the second time around, I still enjoyed the story a great deal. Behind the simple woman on a mission plot, the narrative packs a punch and feels meaningful at a level much deeper than its charming dialogue presents on the surface. I think a big part of this is how the game handles its central themes. Celeste isn't just a story about a girl climbing a mountain. It's a story about mental wellness, identity, and perseverance. Climbing the mountain is a pretty clear allegory for coping with trauma, personal struggles, and mental illness. In Madeline's case, the climb itself mirrors her journey in dealing with depression and learning to accept her negative qualities as part of who she is. These ideas are worked into the story with varying degrees of visibility. The changes in Madeline's expression in the selfie she takes with Theo at different points in the story are a nice little touch. On the flip side, there are points where the game is quite blunt, with characters speaking candidly about anxiety and depression. Personally, I enjoyed the subtler moments a bit more, but it's refreshing to see a game that's unafraid to deal with the stigma of mental illness. It practically hits you over the head at times and screams, "This is a story about depression, deal with it." It's not afraid to shy away from serious themes, and sets a great example for other games in doing so. Level design is another place where Celeste's themes shine through. At the risk of reading in too much and sounding a bit like everyone's least favorite high school English teacher, the environmental features in each chapter, particularly hazards, often seemed symbolic to me. Take the wind in Chapter 4. Its strength and volatility seem to reflect Madeline's disposition. At times it pushes you forwards, allowing you to jump further and reach your goals more swiftly, as does Madeline's undying determination. At other times, it blows back in your face and threatens to send you careening backwards, representing Madeline's anxiety and self-doubt. In Chapter 3, you meet Mr. Oshiro, a hotel proprietor haunted by his imperfections and past mistakes. His difficulties in cleaning clutter from the hotel match his struggle to let go of his own baggage. Levels are plagued by a wiggly sort of moss that sprouts goo on contact, preventing backtracking and symbolizing the ability of the past to hurt us, seemingly saying that you can never go back. Later in the story, you journey through a literal mirror temple as Madeline looks inwards at herself and her other side in a chapter that's cheeky enough to actually call itself Reflection. I could go on. The environmental design is quite brilliant in this respect. Another thing I found interesting about Madeline's journey up the mountain is how it reflects the 5 stages of grief, a model used to explain mourning after the death of a loved one. Even though Madeline isn't grieving anyone when she arrives at the mountain, at least not to our knowledge, she does experience a substantial loss early on in her climb. When Batty escapes, Madeline's understanding of her identity is fundamentally altered, and she loses her prior sense of self. Consequently, Madeline goes through each of the 5 stages. First, we see her in denial, thinking it to be impossible that part of her could be so cruel. Then Madeline grows angry, fittingly reflected in Mr. Oshiro's boss segment as he lashes out and transforms into an embodiment of blind rage. She tries to bargain with Batty in setting her free, and when this ultimately fails, her hopelessness and depression is reflected in their fall to the base of the mountain. Eventually, the two unite to finish the climb together. You reach the top, and as Madeline accepts herself for who she is, there's a tangible sense of resolution. This is a beautiful little story of self-discovery that doesn't pull any punches. Every new trial that Madeline faces is reflected in challenges the player must overcome. Story aside, the design, diversity, and sequencing of these challenges is nothing short of genius. And it's here where Celeste really shines as an engaging game. Celeste is hard. I found it especially difficult, probably because I have the reflexes and coordination of a koala on ketamine wearing oven mitts. Nonetheless, the game's reputation speaks for itself, and even skilled players can easily rack up hundreds or thousands of deaths working through the more advanced optional levels. Lots of people love Celeste for the challenge it offers, and I count myself among them, but the game also embraces players that aren't quite up to its skill barrier. The developers have practiced the opposite of gatekeeping, offering an assist mode for players that require reduced difficulty, whether for reasons of disability, inexperience, or preference. Celeste manages to stay inclusive while still offering a mean challenge and some excellent speedrunner bait. Game Maker's Toolkit has a great video on assist mode, so if you're more interested in how this mode works or game accessibility in general, I highly recommend checking it out. I played without assist mode though, so here I'll be talking about the game's default experience. Difficult as it is, Celeste never frustrated me to the point of giving up, though my stance there might change after I start working my way through the post-game content. I actually enjoyed Celeste because it was hard, which is strange considering I'm generally not huge on games where difficulty is a major selling point. I've struggled to find the fun for myself in Dark Souls, and as much as I love Hollow Knight, it's a game to which I've said, "That's it, I'm done with you right now," more than once. Celeste executes the concept of fun through difficulty brilliantly. The game's challenges pull you in, keep you playing, and leave you feeling satisfied. There are several reasons for this, and I'd like to take a look at the 5 that I see as the most important. Simple but tricky mechanics, doing a lot with a little, level size and sequencing, fairness, and content variety. First, the game's basic mechanics are just that, incredibly basic. Madeline can run, climb, jump, and dash, and that's it. All of these abilities are introduced immediately, and your moveset never changes, apart from the double dash in Chapter 7. This is in stark contrast to what we see in something like a Metroidvania, where players accumulate a vast roster of abilities by the end of the game. Celeste is a very vertical game, pun intended, in the sense that it takes a few basic mechanics and stretches them to the absolute limit, rather than having many different abilities that are only explored briefly. Counterintuitively, Celeste's limited moveset is part of what allows it to have such a high skill cap. The game can count on players attaining a gradual mastery of its controls, rather than needing to stop every few levels to learn some newfangled hyper-ultra double dash ground pound with fire magic. This reduction in surface complexity also prevents players from feeling overwhelmed early on, allowing them to focus on improving their precision instead of grappling with an intricate set of controls. And even with this limited moveset, skilled players are free to experiment with tricks like the Ultra Dash and Corner Bounce, though you're never forced to learn them during the main story. The game feels stripped down in a good way. Celeste takes the essence of what a platforming game should be and polishes the hell out of it. This brings me to my next point, that the game manages to make a lot out of a little. Simple concepts are used in clever ways and repeatedly remixed throughout the game. This is especially true of its environmental challenges. With the exception of a few mainstays, the ubiquitous spike hazards, springy jump pads, and mid-air dash recharges, each chapter has its own special environmental gimmick. These are easy to understand and deceptively simple, but the game manages to do a lot with them, never moving on from an idea until it feels fully explored, and never letting any one idea overstay its welcome. In the first chapter, you're introduced to a box with a traffic light on it. A timer is triggered upon contact, and then the box rapidly moves along a track when the light turns green. You learn quickly that timing a jump off the box can get you extra momentum, flinging you across the level. Then you learn how to use this in conjunction with climbing. Then there's multiple boxes. Then you're using them to cross huge gaps with dash recharges. Then there's spikes on the boxes. Then the boxes are flinging you into spikes, and you're darting around and behind them to find secret levels hidden off to the side, and you get the picture. By the end of the first chapter, you're flying around like a madwoman, wondering how so little of your time can be spent on the ground in a platforming game. Every chapter does something similar with its own gimmick. Chapter 2 has the starry blocks that let you dash through them. Chapter 3 has the little moldy guys in the moss, worms, wiggly stuff that sprouts a void of death wherever you walk. Chapter 4 has bubbles and moving platforms. Chapter 5 has the traveling bubbles and dash switch platforms. And Chapter 6 has the feathers, angry thwomp guys, and bouncy round platforms. In Chapter 7, you're granted the ability to dash twice in a row, and the game remixes all the elements you've seen before into a final gauntlet of farewell challenges. Each of these sequences is beautifully crafted, ramping up complexity at just the right rate to let you feel a strong sense of progression while keeping you on your toes. Part of the reason each of these segments works so well is the way that Celeste sequences individual levels. With each one, difficulty is increased incrementally, whether by introducing a new concept, using an existing concept in a new way, adding an extra sequence of moves, tightening the precision required, or some mixture thereof. The size of levels also plays a part in the game's ability to craft a satisfying series of challenges. Most levels fit their entirety onto a single screen, and most of those that don't are still fairly small. This immediately allows them to be more difficult while minimizing frustration. The smaller the room, the faster it is to practice over and over, allowing quicker mastery of a difficult task. Additionally, players can see everything at the same time, letting them plan out a precise series of moves without needing to memorize anything hidden. Lastly, bite-sized challenges yield an equally bite-sized punishment. Death rarely sets you back far in Celeste, and although failure is always frustrating to a degree, getting right back into the action without losing much progress keeps you from developing a defeatist attitude. Another reason that difficulty in Celeste manages to avoid becoming too frustrating is how fair the game feels. Nothing about Celeste is random. Anything that moves has an easily memorized pattern, and anything that can kill you is telegraphed obviously. Apart from perhaps the occasional glitch, which I never really noticed, every one of my 2,000 or 3,000 odd deaths in Celeste felt like it was my fault, which is a good thing. Dying never felt cheap. Even when I meant for Madeline to do something other than what she did, particularly when I dashed in the wrong direction for the 8,000th time, it was down to my own timing and coordination rather than imprecision on the game's part. This is a game that never gives you an excuse to blame anyone other than yourself for triggering that damn death screen. The subtext every time you fail is an unapologetic get good, and a justified one at that. Once you do get good, Celeste keeps you playing with a cavalcade of optional content for you to hone your skills even further. This brings me to my final point, the astounding variety of content in Celeste. The default version of the levels, the so-called A-sides, are challenging enough to hold the attention of an average player, and taken together create a very full-feeling game. Within these levels, the optional Strawberry and Crystal Heart collectibles provide a series of side challenges players can choose to complete along the way. As if this wasn't enough, Celeste offers progressively harder remixes of each chapter, the B and C sides, as well as 2 bonus chapters after the main storyline and a fully realized 8-bit mini-game version as an unlockable Easter egg. The more punishing levels are enough to keep even the most skilled players on the edge of their seats, and speedruns of the harder levels especially are nothing short of spectacular to watch. Even though the content in Celeste never changes, the game still manages to encourage replayability. After beating absolutely every challenge, there's always the chance to shave off a few seconds or reduce your death count. The joy of difficulty and the complexity the game manages to achieve keeps you coming back. All these factors taken together make challenge in Celeste a magical thing. There's a concept called flow, which is commonly applied to games, first proposed by Hungarian-American psychologist and enunciation nightmare Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, which I'm sure that I still butchered the pronunciation of despite practicing about 6 dozen times during my undergrad. In a nutshell, flow is a state of complete absorption in the task at hand, whereby the player's level of skill is matched more or less exactly by the game's level of challenge. While in flow, your concentration is maximized, and you even lose track of time. Flow is the ultimate state of being present in the moment of gameplay, and Celeste is a master of keeping you in this state. It gets you just skilled enough for the next challenge it throws at you, never shrinking away or feeling too easy. I can't imagine the playtesting that went into balancing this perfectly, but the result is unquestionable. This feeling of incredibly satisfying gameplay is enhanced all the more by the little touches that improve the look, feel, and sound of the game, the everything else that serves as Celeste's third major bastion of player engagement. It's a bit weird that I've taken so long to say this, but the gameplay in Celeste feels amazing. The controls are snappy and responsive, supporting those crazy precision challenges we talked about earlier. Madeline's movement is fluid, with just enough bounciness and acceleration to keep her feeling organic. I use a rather simple test to determine whether a platformer has quote-unquote good controls. If the movement feels satisfying enough that you can amuse yourself for a couple of minutes just running, jumping, and climbing around without trying to accomplish anything in particular, then you've got a solid control scheme on your hands. Celeste passes this test with flying colors, and I'd occasionally stop just to jump and dash around while thinking about how to approach a challenge, or to take a breath after beating a difficult segment. This overall level of quality is somewhat of a double-edged sword though. At least for me, controlling Madeline felt so good that whenever these controls were altered in any way, my experience wasn't as enjoyable. The feather felt sluggish, jumping off of clouds felt laggy at times, and the controls of the Pico 8 version just couldn't live up to the full game. None of these changes felt unintentional, and it's not that any of them are bad per se by any means. But whenever Madeline's regular snappy movement was taken away, I couldn't wait to get back to it. The controls are far from the only thing that makes Madeline's movement feel so satisfying. Her animations are simple but expertly crafted. Look at the relatively subtle squash and stretch of her jump and dash, which keep her feeling light, springy, and full of life. All of Madeline's movements follow through to her hair as well, contributing further to the fantastic sense of fluidity in controlling her. Watching Madeline's hair color change after a dash, particularly during long aerial segments, is just plain mesmerizing. A few visual effects help to convey your momentum, with a brilliant streak animation to accompany the dash, and a trailing ripple for boosting off walls and moving platforms. The screen shakes almost imperceptibly during a dash, accompanied by a much more noticeable rumble of the gamepad, lending the move a sense of weight. The sound design surrounding Madeline's movement is equally excellent. Every move, from your basic jump and dash to negotiating elements of the environment like the springboard, bubbles, and bouncy clouds, is accompanied by its own sound effect, creating a rapid-fire symphony of sorts during quick movement sequences. The crystals that recharge your dash emit an ethereal, metallic ping with a sparkly echo, giving you the sense that you've just picked up some fleeting bit of treasure. The game design term most apt to describe all of this is juice. A game is often described as juicy when it crams in every bit of feedback possible for player interactions, animation, visual effects, and sound effects, and polishes them to an extreme degree. Celeste does this with everything, without going too far. The juice in Celeste doesn't waste your time on needless, unskippable animations or overplay sound effects until you're driven mad. It drips from every one of your actions but never interferes with gameplay. Even death in Celeste is juicy, with a neat light burst visual effect, a sharp reverberation as Madeline winks out of existence, and a screen wipe customized to the events of each chapter, all in less than 5 seconds. And it's a good thing the death sequence is so quick and enjoyable to watch, because you'll be seeing a lot of it unless you've got lightning-fast reflexes. Both Madeline's controls and the juicy effects associated with moving around her environment contribute to the game's overall feel. The sophisticated part of you, the part that's played a lot of games and understands what good simulated physics feel like, can appreciate the game's fantastic controls. All that juice, on the other hand, plays more to your basic animal instincts of going after shiny things that make fun noises. In satisfying both your inner gamer and your inner magpie, Celeste is just fun to look at and play. Stepping back from Madeline for a moment, the game's overall art and sound direction are also incredibly well executed. The game looks beautiful, with a crisp pixel aesthetic and a palette that's limited enough to give everything a bright retro feel while staying suitably varied between areas. I love the contrast between the pixel graphics of the main game and the hand-drawn portraits using cutscenes, though I'm a bit mixed on the 3D overworld, which feels like a little bit of a disconnect. It does a good job of showing them out in scale, though, and is nicely done on its own. And maybe this is just me, but from what I've seen of it, though parts of Chapter 9 are quite beautiful, some of the segments, particularly with the pufferfish and electricity fields on pink backgrounds, look a bit ugly in comparison to the rest of the game. These are minor nitpicks though, and the art in Celeste is certainly a treat for the eyes. The soundtrack, composed by Lena Raine, fits the game very well. It keeps the retro feeling alive while leveraging all the interesting sound textures that can be achieved from modern digital instrumentation. Tracks are appropriately varied in their tone and suit the events of the story, reflecting Madeline's mood and helping to put players in the right mindset to best appreciate what's going on. Take this track that plays during the dream sequence in Chapter 2, with its lofty arpeggios and airy piano melody. After you meet Batty, the track remixes itself, sounding darker and almost haunted as Madeline tries to literally outrun her demons. The Mirror Temple has another fantastic track, with both vocal and instrument samples played in reverse. There's also a well-known Easter egg in this piece when you play those vocal samples in reverse, revealing an expression of Madeline's anxiety and self-doubt.
Sometimes I don't really know what's going on anymore. I don't.
Lastly, I'd like to share one of my favorite tracks, which plays when you chase down Batty at the end of Chapter 6. I love everything about this song, from its distinctly 80s vibe to the tribal-esque chanting samples and its clear message to the player. Amp yourself up, because big things are happening. Though these pieces are some of my favorites, the whole soundtrack maintains this level of quality. It's worth listening to on its own, and all the recognition Celeste has received for its scoring and sound design has been more than earned. Celeste is a delight for the senses in every sense of the word. There are lots of other things about the way this game is designed and presented that don't really fit in well with the categories I've discussed already. But before I wrap up, here's a few other things that stuck out about the game and kept me wanting more, some miscellaneous favorites that didn't really fit in anywhere else. The bonus content in the Mirror Temple was fantastic. Though I skipped most of the optional challenges my first time through, upon returning this was some of my favorite content in the entire game. These levels required both a bit of light puzzle solving and quick reflexes to complete, and had a great balance of the two for my tastes. Also, the bubbles that take you across rooms throughout the Mirror Temple are just fantastically satisfying to interact with. The sequences to unlock the B-side cassettes are a wildly fun departure from the rest of the game while still feeling like they belong. Maybe it's because I'm a fan of rhythm games in general and played way too much Harmonite in high school, but I found these immensely satisfying. I wish the game had more sequences like this. I probably could have played at least an entire chapter built on this concept. The samples used for characters' voice clips are adorable, and I couldn't help but smile in spite of myself when Theo threw out a YOLO for the first time. Similar to the Mirror Temple's bubbles, I found the starry dash blocks from Chapter 2 to be a ton of fun, and one of the best environmental gimmicks I've seen in a platformer. They further enhance the fluidity of Madeline's movement, provide some opportunities for a bit of light puzzling, and have absolutely gorgeous visual and sound effects to go along with them. I like the way environmental secrets were used in this game. They're usually telegraphed quite well, so you'll notice them if you're looking, but they're hardly obvious if you're not searching for them. You never know what's coming either. A newly opened passage could lead to a short challenge for a single strawberry, a sequence of rooms ending in a crystal heart, or one of the B-side cassette rooms. Discovering these felt fantastic and rewarding every time. I could go on, but I'm already getting dangerously close to ranting territory, so I think that will do for now. Stepping back to look at the bigger picture, it's easy to see why Celeste is such a compelling game. Everything about Celeste is well thought out and polished, from its gameplay to its level design and even its story. There's a bit of something in this game for most everyone, and with how well done each of these aspects are on their own, the game manages to keep you enthralled no matter what brought you there in the first place. When I first picked up Celeste, based on its reputation, I expected a punishingly difficult platformer with fairly standard level design, some pleasing pixel art, and a heavy-handed story about depression. What I got was an incredibly satisfying adventure with some creative challenges, beautiful art, a story far more thoughtful than I would have imagined, and a soundtrack that unexpectedly blew me away. I didn't think Celeste would even be my type of game, but it's quickly grown to be one of my favorites, and one of the most engaging titles I've played in a long time. I thoroughly enjoyed my time on Celeste Mountain, and I have no doubts that I'll be returning for many more climbs in the future.